All right, let's dive deep into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. This book, it's touched so many lives, and we're going to figure out like why it still resonates so strongly today, all these years later.
It's pretty amazing.
What's really cool is we're not just looking at the book itself. We're going into excerpts from a whole podcast script about it.
Oh, wow.
It's like a deep dive inside a deep dive, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely meta. It kind of gives us this unique chance to really break down those core ideas in man's search for meaning and figure out how they connect to our own lives.
That's exactly it. And, when I think about this book, it's not just about surviving tough times. I mean, Frankl's experience in the camps, that's definitely a huge part of it. It's more about this human need to find meaning, even when things are really, really rough.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Frankl, he was a psychiatrist, right? And he saw this thing with his fellow prisoners, those who had a why or a reason to keep going, a purpose. They were the ones who tended to survive. It wasn't just physical strength. It was something way deeper.
I remember that Nietzsche quote from the material. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. Powerful stuff. But it makes me wonder, how did that apply to us? I mean, most of us, thankfully, haven't gone through anything like that.
That's a really good point, and that's where Frankl's work becomes, universal, applies to everyone. He says this idea of finding meaning, it's for all of us. It doesn't matter what our situation is, even in regular everyday life. Having a goal, a passion, even just a small thing to look forward to, that can make a huge difference in how we handle challenges.
So it's like having that North Star, something to guide us when things are dark.
Exactly. It's about building that inner strength, that resilience that comes from having a purpose. And, this brings us to something really important in Frankl's work, this idea of finding meaning in suffering. It's a bit of a sensitive topic, but it's at the heart of his message.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to see how they handle this in the podcast script because, it's one thing to say find meaning in suffering, but it's a whole other thing to actually do it.
Absolutely. Frankl, he doesn't shy away from suffering, not at all. He went through it himself, but he also believed that we have a choice in how we react to it. There's this powerful example in the script. Frankl is in these horrible conditions, and he's picturing himself giving lectures about his experiences, but after the war, in the future.
Wow.
That vision, that sense of purpose, it gave him strength when things were at their darkest.
That's incredible. It shows that even when we can't control what's happening around us, we can still choose how we think, how we feel inside.
Yeah.
But how does this connect to logotherapy? Frankl's therapy approach.
Yeah.
That's the part I'm really curious about.
Yeah. Logotherapy, they call it meaning-centered therapy. It's the core of Frankl's work, and it's based on three main principles: freedom of choice, responsibility, and individual meaning.
Okay, so let's break those down. What does freedom of choice actually mean in this context?
It means that even when things are really bad, we always have the power to choose how we respond. We can choose our attitude, our thoughts, even our actions. It doesn't mean we ignore the pain, or pretend everything's fine, but it does mean that there's this space inside of us where we can find freedom, even when the outside world is limiting us.
So it's like cultivating that inner space, that inner strength, even when the world around us feels crazy and out of control.
That's it, exactly. And that's where the second principle comes in: responsibility. Logotherapy says we are responsible for finding and fulfilling our own unique meaning in life. It's not something that someone just gives us. It's something we create through our choices and actions.
I see how these principles connect. We have this freedom to choose, but that also means we have this responsibility to create a life that means something to us. What about that third principle, individual meaning? How does that fit in?
Well, this principle emphasizes that meaning it's deeply personal.
Mm-hmm.
What gives one person a sense of purpose, it might be totally different for someone else. Like for some, meaning is in family, in relationships. For others, it could be in creative things or activism or connecting with nature. There's no right or wrong answer. It's all about figuring out what truly matters to you as an individual.
That's so freeing, isn't it? We don't have to try and fit into someone else's idea of what a meaningful life should be.
Yeah.
But, thinking about it, that also makes it kind of harder to find because it's all on us.
Yeah, I can see how you'd feel that way. It can feel overwhelming. Like, how do I find my unique meaning? But, Frankl gives us some guidance. He says, think about your talents, what you're passionate about, the values that are most important to you, and pay attention to those times when you feel most alive, most engaged. Those moments can be clues to what really matters to you.
This is making a lot of sense. It's like we need to become detectives in our own lives, looking for clues to our own unique purpose.
I love that. And this brings us to another important part of Frankl's work, and it might surprise you. It's how he sees happiness. Man's search for meaning, it's not your typical self-help book about being happy.
Wait, so if it's not about finding happiness, then what is it about?
It's about something much, much deeper. Frankl says happiness, we can't chase it directly. It's not the goal itself. Happiness, he says, it's what happens when you live a good life, a life that has meaning and purpose.
So it's not about chasing happiness, it's about finding meaning, and then happiness just kind of comes along with it. That's a really interesting idea. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. Imagine someone who dedicates their life to a cause they believe in, maybe fighting for social justice or protecting the environment. That kind of work, it often involves sacrifice, challenges, even times of, feeling down, but it also gives them this deep sense of purpose. It's like their life has meaning, it matters. And from that sense of purpose, that dedication to something bigger than themselves, that's where happiness comes in. It's not a fleeting feeling. It's this deep and lasting satisfaction that comes from living a life that's in line with their values.
That makes a lot of sense. But, how do we find that kind of purpose, that kind of meaning that really fulfills us?
That's a great question, and that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. Frankl actually gives us some practical advice on how to uncover our own unique meaning, even when things are tough.
I can't wait to hear more. This is giving me a lot to think about already, and I bet our listeners are feeling the same way. We'll be back after a quick break.
So before the break, we were talking about Frankl's idea that happiness, you don't chase it. It's kind of like a side effect of living a life that has meaning.
Yeah, it's funny. Before this deep dive, I always saw man's search for meaning as like a guide to being tough, how to handle hardship. But now I'm realizing it's so much more. It's almost like a guide to living a good life, a life that feels right no matter what's going on around you.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to the question you asked before the break, like how do we actually find that deep meaning in our lives, the kind that really satisfies us? The good news is Frankl doesn't just give us these big ideas, he actually offers some ways to discover our purpose.
All right, lay it on me. What are the steps?
Well, there's no magic formula, but Frankl talks about three main ways to find meaning. He calls them values of creation, values of experience, and values of attitude.
Okay, let's break those down. Values of creation. What's that all about?
That's about giving something to the world, making a difference through what we do. Think of artists, inventors, entrepreneurs, even parents raising kids. They're all creating something, leaving their mark in their own way. Frankl thought that this act of creation, making something new, is a powerful way to find meaning.
So if someone loves to build things or solve problems or express themselves creatively, that values of creation thing might be right up their alley.
Exactly. It's about finding that satisfaction in the act of creating itself, bringing an idea to life, making the world a little bit better. And it doesn't have to be huge, It could be writing a poem, building a birdhouse, even cooking a great meal for your family. It's not about the size of the thing you create. It's about the creating itself, putting something good out into the world.
That's good to hear. Now, what about values of experience? What kind of experiences can make us feel like our life has meaning?
That one's about finding meaning by really experiencing the world around us. It could be connecting with nature, enjoying art and beauty, building relationships that matter, or doing something kind for others. It's about opening ourselves up to how rich life is and finding those moments that make us feel truly alive and connected.
I know those moments when you're so absorbed in something, whether it's listening to music that moves you or having a deep conversation with a friend, time just stops and you're just there in that moment. Those experiences are powerful.
You got it. Those moments of deep connection, of feeling alive and present, they can be incredibly meaningful. And Frankl believed that those experiences, whether it's through nature, art, relationships, or kindness, they're a powerful way to find meaning in life.
Okay, so we've got creating, we've got experiencing. What about that third one, values of attitude? That sounds kind of, a little more abstract.
This is where Frankl gets really deep. He says, even when we're suffering, even when we can't control what's happening to us, we can still choose how we think about it, our attitude.
Now, that's interesting. But how can just choosing our attitude, how can that give our life meaning, especially when things are really tough?
Imagine someone with a serious illness. They can't control the fact that they're sick, but they can choose how they deal with it. They can choose to face it with courage, to focus on what they can control, like their mindset, how they spend their time. They can even find meaning in their suffering by helping others or leaving a positive mark on the world.
That's a powerful example. It's like finding that inner strength, that resilience, even when it feels like everything's falling apart around you.
Exactly. And Frankl believed that this ability to choose our attitude, to find meaning even when we're suffering, that's the ultimate freedom we have as humans. It's in those moments when we've lost everything else that our true selves really shine through.
This is really making me think differently about how I deal with tough stuff in my own life. It's not about pretending things are okay or ignoring the pain. It's about finding that strength inside to go through difficult things with purpose and grace.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, Frankl didn't just talk about this stuff, he lived it. He found meaning in a concentration camp, a place designed to take away people's humanity. If he could find meaning there, then we can definitely find it in our own lives, even with all the challenges and uncertainty we face.
That's incredibly inspiring. But it also makes me wonder, we talked about these three paths to meaning: creation, experience, attitude. What if someone's having trouble finding meaning in any of those? What if they just feel lost?
That's a really common feeling, and Frankl knew that. He came up with this technique within logotherapy. It's called dereflection, specifically to deal with that feeling of being lost. It's a really interesting approach that can help people shift their perspective and find a new sense of purpose.
This sounds like something our listeners really need to hear. Tell me more about this dereflection technique.
Well, it's a little bit. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd think. Instead of, telling people to look inside and analyze all their feelings, which sometimes make things worse, dereflection is about shifting your attention outward, focusing on doing things that have meaning, getting involved in the world.
So instead of getting stuck on that question, what's the meaning of my life?
Yeah.
You'd encourage someone to just do something, anything that feels right to them, even if it's small.
Yeah, exactly. It's about taking the focus off yourself and putting it on something bigger, something that sparks even a little bit of interest, a little bit of purpose. Volunteering, a hobby, reconnecting with people you care about, anything that gets them out of their own head and into the world, doing stuff.
That reminds me of that saying, action precedes motivation. Sometimes you just got to take that first step, even if it seems small, and then that can set off a whole chain of events.
That's a great way to think about it. By doing things that are meaningful, even if we don't have it all figured out, we create the space for meaning to kind of pop up naturally. It's like planting seeds in a garden. You don't see the results right away, but if you take care of them, something beautiful can grow.
That's given me a whole new perspective on those times when I've felt stuck, like I didn't know what to do with my life. Instead of getting overwhelmed by trying to find my big purpose, maybe it's more about those smaller things, the stuff that feels meaningful right now.
That's the whole idea behind dereflection. It's about giving ourselves permission to take action, even when we're not sure what the big picture is. And a lot of times, it's through doing those things, by interacting with the world in a way that matters to us, that we start to figure out our deeper purpose, what we're really here to do.
So if someone's listening to this and they feel lost or like they don't have direction in their life, what's one thing they could do today to try out this dereflection thing?
It's all about finding something, anything, that even slightly interests them or makes them curious. Then just taking one small step towards it. Sign up for a class, call up an old friend, go for a walk in nature. The important thing is to stop overthinking and start doing.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of Frankl's work, but we've uncovered some really valuable stuff. And for our listeners who want to explore this further, I highly recommend checking out Man's Search for Meaning. It's a book that can truly change your life.
And even if you don't have time to read the whole book right now, keep these ideas in mind. Remember, you always have the freedom to choose your attitude, that meaning can be found even in difficult times, and that happiness often comes when you live a life with purpose.
We've covered so much today, from the power of having a why to finding meaning in the face of life's challenges. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. Viktor Frankl talked a lot about taking responsibility for our lives, about creating meaning through our choices and our actions. So I ask you, dear listener, what one small step can you take today, even a tiny one, to move towards a life that feels more meaningful, more in line with what you believe in?
That's a great question to reflect on. Remember, even the smallest actions can create a ripple effect. What seeds of meaning will you plant today?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into man's search for meaning. We hope it sparks some inspiration and encourages you to start your own journey of finding meaning. Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep living a life filled with purpose.